Does that make sense? The taser policy and the use of force policy.
Yes,
The
I would
whole
almost
time
say
it's going,
that
I'm
this
thinking
policy
it was on my
300
main
is
channel
an
live,
overarching
but-
umbrella that covers all use of force, and then within our policy manual, we'll get
So
more
now it is.
specific on some of the tools and tactics and techniques.
Okay. And if you would scroll down to the bottom of the page, please. The policy is listed here.
All right, look.
I draw your attention to the first line.
I'm about to get out of
Use
here,
of
yo.
force is a matter
Hey,
of
Angela.
critical concern both to the
About to
public
get out
and
of
the law
here.
enforcement community.
Look,
Can you explain in your mind why that is a
I'll
matter
be
of
back
critical
at
concern?
5 and at 7. Justice Smollett at 5, at 7:30.
Not many jobs or
15.
professions or careers are
Right.
you
Thank God.
authorized
Don't forget,
and,
Lady
and
Van
mandated in
Camp
times to
goes
use
forward.
force. It's a
Because
significant
we all we got. I see y'all then.
reach
Thank
of the
y'all.
government.
God bless.
And so that's what's critical about it, right? I mean,
Use of force is significant, and it's going to play into any kind of ongoing relationship between the police or the government and the community and society. This, I think, just tries to signal how critical it can be.
now the next paragraph talks about officers having an understanding and appreciation for their authority and limitations. Is that true?
Yes.
Why?
We are, peace officers are in a unique role. We've got a unique set of responsibilities, tasks, mandates, and I want our officers to always be aware of that special position, that special job that they have.
And then I would ask you to scroll to the next page. The top paragraph, the policy continues. What is that first line about?
The Brooklyn Center Police Department recognizes and respects the value of all human life and dignity without prejudice to anyone.
And so the second sentence appears to acknowledge the ability to use force.
Vesting officers with the authority to use reasonable force and to protect the public welfare requires monitoring, evaluation, and a careful balancing of all interests.
What interests are being brought up there?
I think essentially all interests. Again, it just speaks to the unique relationship between law enforcement and the community.
Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on teaching the application of force with you, but I do want to just touch on a couple areas. So if we could scroll down to 300.3. Fair to say that this is the basic statement about the amount of force that a police officer can use.
Yes.
So in the first line, the amount of force that reasonably appears necessary given the facts and circumstances preceded by the officer at the time to accomplish a legitimate law enforcement purpose.
Yes.
And from there are a lot of other provisions in the policy, but is that the basic explanation?
Yes, that's, I'll call it foundational, is any force used should only be reasonable.
And we see the second paragraph talks about judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene at the time, correct?
Yes.
And the officers have to make quick decisions sometimes.
Yes.
And in evolving and changing situations, correct?
Yes, the real world changes constantly.
And are your officers expected to take those things into consideration when using force?
We expect them to make good decisions using new information that becomes known to them.
And the third paragraph there, I think the first line is something you've already referred to. It's hard to predict every factual situation, right?
Yes.
But what's the
Good morning,
last
Nick.
line of that paragraph?
Officers are entrusted to use well-reasoned discretion in determining the appropriate use of force in each incident.
Yeah. Y'all want something crazy? I want like a, yeah. Yes. Is that a truck you got or is that a car? How much was that? Yeah. Fully loaded, the white one?
Now, as long as we're here, please scroll
I'm
down
looking
to
at that, but then I see on
300.3.1.
BMW bring out an X9.
That's an acknowledgement that
I
officers
looked at that, I said, oh,
have the authority to make a lawful arrest, correct?
I don't know.
Yes.
And that would include, for instance, on a warrant.
An arrest warrant, yes.
And if we can scroll down to 300.3.2,
Is that bad?
this lists the factors that could go into
But
determining
you
the
gotta
reasonable
go
use of force,
a
correct?
super, right?
Yes.
And is it your belief that this is
But
consistent
you gotta put
with
premium in.
constitutional and state law?
So how it burn like that? Wait a minute, premium's for the burn slow.
Do you want to lay additional foundation, counsel?
Sure. In approving these policies or being part of that process, have you become familiar with the constitutional and state law standards or factors used to determine reasonable force?
Generally, yes. Generally, yes.
And have you also learned those through training?
Yes.
And you reviewed this policy yourself before today?
Yeah, that's like
And
$50.
are these the kinds of factors that go into determining the reasonableness of force that's used?
I believe so, yes.
And would you expect officers in your department to take these things into consideration in deciding whether to use force or what force to use?
When determining how much force, yes.
And one of those is
Wow, I
the
seen that outfit.
immediacy of and severity of a threat to officers.
Yes.
And if you could scroll down, please, to the next page. The seriousness of the suspected offense, another one of those factors.
Yes, sir.
Potential injury to officers, suspects, and others is one of those.
Yes.
Also, the risk and reasonably foreseeable consequences of escape,
Correct.
Yeah, I said I was on hop. I said I was on.
as well as the apparent need for immediate control of the
Then
individual.
come past freedom.
Yes.
See what started going on there.
If you could scroll down to the next page to 300.4.
Yeah, it's boring. There's nothing there for me. It's like when you
And does the
outgrow a
policy
student.
also speak to the use of deadly force?
It does.
And is there also state law
Everybody I know
describing the use
evil.
of deadly force?
Born.
There is, yes.
Is that in fact
Pastor
actually
or
cited
gay.
right here in
Went in
the
jail.
policy?
Yes.
So is it your belief that the policy here is
Or they in
consistent
committed
with?
relationships with their boyfriend.
Yes.
Or they in committed relationships with their boyfriend. Like, no, you can't hang with him. Like, why? What is your
Just below that is a provision on moving vehicles, correct?
Correct.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Why does the use of force policy have a separate section on moving vehicles?
I guess I can't specifically say why it's in this policy and not another policy, but when we look more at 300.4, you're going to see some reference to deadly force.
Okay, so let's go down to the next page and explain to the jury what you mean.
We wanted to articulate here that shooting at a moving vehicle or from a moving vehicle is significant. When, as the policy outlines, when feasible, officers should take reasonable steps to move out of the path of an approaching vehicle instead of discharging their vehicle at a vehicle or any of its occupants. An officer should only discharge a firearm at a moving vehicle or its occupants when the officer reasonably believes there are no other reasonable means available to avert the imminent threat of the vehicle or of deadly force other than the vehicle's directed at the officer or others. We want to discourage officers from being in a position where they could be struck by a moving vehicle, but yet we never want to take away the ability for an officer to defend him or herself or another.
Why do you want to discourage shooting at the occupants of a vehicle,
That was
of a moving vehicle?
Okay. All right. Excuse me.
June.
Mr. Gray, would you please ask to have a sidebar instead of doing talking objections, all we have to do is ask sidebar.
But I know everybody up there
and,
trying to get married
do
now.
that. Are you done?
They trying to get married.
I think he corrected himself, and he now, Mr. Frank, you are corrected,
Shit, everybody
correct?
up there trying to get married.
I don't know if the court heard me, but while he was objecting, I was correcting myself, attempting to. So my question is, why do you want to discourage shooting at occupants of a moving vehicle?
Because see, you ain't in Baltimore. You in Baltimore.
If it's to stop the vehicle, my understanding is that's rarely effective.
If
That's
you
what
were
I'm saying.
to
You live in Baltimore County, so it's what I'm
injure in some way by shooting the driver of the vehicle, what could happen?
And you supposed to get out
A
the
variety of things could happen.
Like what?
You supposed to get out
The objection is overruled?
Yeah, so
The vehicle could strike something or somebody.
shit. One day I'm
I'm going
gonna.
to ask to scroll down to 300.8. Does the policy speak to training?
Yes.
And does it require that officers be trained on the use of force policies and law?
It does.
And how often do they have to be trained on that?
At least annually.
And do you believe that that happens at the Brooklyn City Police Department?
Yes.
I'm just at the point where I just.
This use of force policy, can you tell the jurors when the last time it was sent out to officers?
December 8th of 2020.
And the last time that then Officer Potter acknowledged it?
December 29th of 2020.
Separate from use of force, is there a separate policy on firearms?
There is, yes.
I'm just.
And
I don't know.
I'm going to
because I
offer
already
Exhibit
said
306, Your Honor, which is the policy on
Once I
firearms.
make it big, if I'm not married, then I'm not going to get married. I don't know.
And, oops, my mistake. I got the wrong exhibit number. 342, I'm sorry. It's policy 306, correct?
Because then I know my trust game.
Do officers carry a firearm every day when they're on the job?
Unless they're on light duty or some kind of administrative detail.
Yeah, I should have been more specific. When they go out on the street, do they carry a firearm?
Yes.
And so this policy, drawing your attention to
Where
the
would you at every time?
306.1.1. So they are required to complete departmental training regarding the use of force and deadly force and firearms before being authorized to do that, to carry it every day, correct?
Yes.
And does your department provide that training?
Yes.
And how often is firearms training provided?
Well, equally yoked, right?
Ideally quarterly, at a minimum. Everyone will qualify with their firearms once a year. And then we try and incorporate additional firearms-related training throughout the year.
And when you say qualify, what does that
have
mean?
somebody who yoked.
There's a course of fire, specific distances, some time frames, some positions and orientations you're shooting from. It's a qualification. It's a pass or fail evolution.
So officers are required to fire their firearms
Yes.
and at least annually,
Yes.
and that means having them in their holster and drawing them and using them.
Yes.
Because me and your homegirls
If
were
they're-
talking here, but
I don't want to say graded, that seems a little elementary, but
They're evaluated.
somebody
And,
should come
if
up,
we
brother
could-
Jamel.
scroll down to 306.5.
Me and him know each other. I don't know why. Yeah, because she was like, oh, I'm going to call you.
Draw your attention to the first line of that paragraph or that section. What does it say?
Yeah.
Members shall not unnecessarily display or handle any firearm.
And I actually meant the sentence before that first, but
Members shall maintain the highest level of safety when handling firearms and shall consider the following.
and then not to unnecessarily display your handle. Correct?
Yes.
That's one of many reasons, but you expect officers to have the highest level of safety.
Yes.
Is that part of firearms training and how to safely handle firearms?
Yes.
We see a lot of references in the training to
But I wish you
Low
knew
light.
how it was down here.
training. Can you describe for the jury what that means?
When low light is referenced in the policies, it's getting at either at night or maybe in a building without lights on, basically in the dark. Post mandates are part of the annual firearms qualification, also includes some training in low light and inclement weather,
The reality of police work, right?
especially in Minnesota, yes.
Yes. So that's all part of the firearms training,
Yeah.
those differing conditions.
Yes.
And
Can't pick it up and go. But I said,
can you tell the jurors when the last time this firearms policy was sent out to officers?
September 7th of 2017.
And when did then Officer Potter acknowledge it?
October 9th of 2017.
Has the department incorporated a policy on vehicle pursuits?
Yes.
And just to, can you basically describe what's covered by the vehicle pursuit policy? What kind of conduct are we talking about?
When officers may engage in pursuing a vehicle, a car chase, what types of situations that could be warranted and authorized in, what types of situations it's not. It goes into a variety of factors that we ask the officers to constantly reevaluate during the course of a pursuit on whether or not it should be continued or not. And it gets into some tactics.
Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 338, which is the vehicle pursuit policy.
Admitted into evidence.
I'm going to draw your attention to the second paragraph, the full recipe paragraph. You see the second line starts with a sentence with "in recognizing." Can you describe for the jurors that language there?
In recognizing the risk to public safety created by vehicle pursuits, no officer or supervisor shall be criticized or disciplined for deciding not to engage in a vehicle pursuit.
Hello everyone, Tim Blotz here in the Fox 9 studios, welcoming you back to our coverage of the Kim Potter trial and a manslaughter trial where she is pleaded not guilty in the death of Daunte Wright from the traffic stop from last April. You've just been watching during the lunch break Garrett Fleslin, the commander with the Brooklyn Center Police Department. He was on the stand this morning. We are now just back from our lunch break this afternoon. We were expecting on this time a use of force expert
This
from
lady
Brooklyn
gonna say she not
Brooklyn
guilty
Center
and
Police
she shot that
Department
man with a
to
gun
take the
instead of a
witness
taser.
stand. Let's return you now back to the courtroom live for the streaming coverage.
And
Here's
she
Judge
says she
Regina
not guilty.
Chu.
So, pretty much, I'm working on this Black Panther thing. Yeah. Well, we on break. We be on break, and because some crazy mess happened with one of the main stars. She almost killed herself. Yeah.
Okay, please be seated. Oops.
And then I got a supporting role on BMF, but I go for a main role.
Please be seated.
Yep.
The state may call its next witness.
But the supporting role is the guy named Antonio, where I'm like supporting.
The state would call Sergeant Mike Peterson this day?
Where action be a film.
Okay, Sergeant, please come forward. Stand behind the witness chair.
Joe
And
Biden
do you swear under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully answer questions pertaining to this case? Please have a seat. And then state your full name and spell it.
Can I take my mask off?
Yes, take your mask off.
Sergeant Mike Peterson, MikePeterson.
All right, Sergeant. The court reporter is taking everything down. Yes or no answers. No shaking of your head. No uh-huh and wait until the question's finished before you answer so that two people are talking at a time. If you don't understand a question, please let the lawyer know. And finally, if an objection is made, stop talking. Don't answer it unless I tell you to. Okay? Counsel?
Thank you. Sergeant Peterson, can you tell us how you are currently employed?
I'm currently a police sergeant at the City of Brooklyn Center.
And so are you a peace officer?
I'm a licensed peace officer in the state of Minnesota.
How long have you been licensed as a peace officer?
16 years.
Can you tell the jurors what your educational background is leading up to your work as a police officer?
Yes. I obtained a 4-year degree from Metropolitan State University in law enforcement.
I'm about to send it to you right now.
During that time, I completed my practical skills, which allowed me to take the licensure test, which I passed, and then was hired by the City of Brooklyn Center as a police officer.
So, when did you complete your education at Metro State?
2005.
And when did you complete the skills?
2005.
And do you recall when you obtained your license?
I would have been in late August, early September of 2005.
And how long after that then did you become employed for the City of Brooklyn Center?
I was employed on September 12th, 2005.
Do you remember the date specifically?
I do.
Why?
It's relation to September 11th.
I see. And that was the day that you started? Did you get sworn in that day?
It's the day that I started my training. I don't remember when I specifically was sworn in.
Now, did you have any law enforcement related experience before being a licensed peace officer?
In 2004, I was hired by the City of Brooklyn Center as a community service officer and worked during that time while I was going through school until I was hired as a police officer.
So, community service officers are not sworn licensed officers, but they work for the department. Is that fair?
Correct.
And so you did that 2 years as you completed your education, your skills, and then applied with Brooklyn Center to be a police officer.
Correct.
And you got hired then, correct?
Yes.
And what were your first duties when you started?
Once I was through the field training, I was a patrol officer working the night shift.
And so that beat me to the question. You did work as in the field training program when you first started?
Yeah, when I first started, I was trained by senior officers in how to become a police officer.
And you recall how long you were in that program, roughly?
Approximately 3.5 months is the program that we use.
When you started, you went on patrol, correct?
Correct.
So you're handling calls in the streets and whatever comes up, right?
Yes.
And how long did you do that?
Approximately 5 years until I received an assignment.
Okay, and what was that assignment?
The assignment there was I moved into our street crimes unit.
And how did that change your duties, what you did?
I was not bound to calls for service, so I didn't have to listen to dispatch to tell me to go to a specific thing. My job was more to analyze some of the problems in the city with the group that I was assigned into that unit with and try and solve those problems.
And how long did you do that?
Roughly 4 years, but I was in and out of patrol during that time as well. So it was 2 years in street crimes, but it took quite a while to get that 2 years in.
And why was that?
Staffing issues.
And at some point, did you get a promotion, for lack of a better term?
Years down the road, I was promoted to sergeant, yes.
Do you recall when it was that you became a sergeant?
I became a sergeant in 2018.
And is that what your current position is?
Correct.
When you became a sergeant, what was your role? What kind of sergeant, for what purpose?
I was a sergeant of patrol.
Okay, I think you said that, sorry. And so when you became a sergeant patrol, did you supervise a number of other officers?
I did. Initially, I was assigned to the night shift supervision.
So how many officers typically would you have under your supervision during a shift?
Anywhere between 5 and 8.
Now, at some point in your career with Brooklyn Center, did you get involved in training?
I did.
And when did you first really get involved in the training, in presenting training, not going to it?
2007 was when I was selected as a use of force instructor.
And when you say selected, who selected you?
The sergeant who is currently in charge of our training program.
And when you were selected for that, did you do some additional training to become a use of force instructor?
Over the years, I've been through numerous trainings to prepare me to become an instructor.
Okay. And if you could just kind of tell the jury, like over which years, and just kind of generally what that training means, or what it's like.
Well, every officer that we select for use of force instructor is slightly different. There's no set curriculum. When I was selected as an instructor, the first training that I went to is to become a Taser instructor. After I was able to show my skills and becoming an instructor for that, I then went to firearms instruction school, and that became my primary training method, where I trained in firearms. Eventually, I went through an arrest and control school and many other schools in the different disciplines that we teach our officers in.
Hello?
And so was this a career move that you decided on, or was...
Yes, it's something that I wanted to do.
Why?
Those are website was up free.
I enjoy teaching. I have teaching kind of in my family.
So do I cash it?
I wanted to make sure that the partners that I work with are some of the best trained officers in the state of Minnesota.
And why would that be important to you?
Selfishly, my own personal safety.
As a police officer, do you serve the
But that's why I
community?
said,
I do,
And is that a factor in why you wanted to do it?
of course.
Now, we have seen in some records and things
You pick it
the
up.
title of training sergeant. Is that
and
your...
just tell me how much the price is.
Was that your title?
It's an ancillary title, yes. Additional duties on top of my other duties.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I was going to ask. When you get involved in training, does that mean you don't have to do other work as much?
No, it's additional duties on top of becoming a patrol officer or whatever assignment you have at the time.
So, since 2007, when you became a use of force instructor, you continued to work as a patrol officer and now a sergeant.
Yes, through all of my assignments.
Currently, are you still involved in training as an instructor?
Yes.
And so who are your supervisors above you?
I couldn't hear the question.
Who are your supervisors above you? Like, who do you respond to? Or
I have several bosses. Commander Flesland is my boss in charge of training, and I also have a boss in charge of the patrol division.
okay, and who is that?
Currently, Commander Flesland. Last year it was Acting Chief Grunig, at the time Commander Grunig.
Okay. So if you would describe for the jurors, since you became let me back up a little. In 2007, you became a use and force instructor. And does that, or did that, include many different kinds of force that an officer could use? Horribly worded question. Let me try over.
Thank you.
We think of use of force as maybe pulling a gun, punching somebody. When you're a use of force instructor, you talked about taser and a firearm, but is it all kinds of force that an officer might use?
Yes.
And at some point, did you sort of take on a supervisory role in Brooklyn Center trainings for police officers?
An informal leader role amongst the other instructors, yes.
How many use of force instructors does the department typically have?
We try to have somewhere between 6 and 10, but it fluctuates based on our staffing levels.
And so can you tell the jurors, how you get involved in, or what your role is in putting a training together?
Currently today,
Sure.
so as the training sergeant, I work with the instructors to develop a plan ahead of the training, to go over some concepts that meet the requirements that we must train our officers in by state regulations. I give them a general idea of what we're thinking of doing, give them the ability to come up with some different plans that they want to implement the ideas, and then we write a lesson plan together. That lesson plan is submitted to the state post board for approval of training credits.
And why do you have to submit that to the post board for approval?
To show that we're meeting the obligations that the state has put on us for use of force training.
So as a licensed peace officer, are you required to get a certain number of hours of training to keep your license?
It's not a certain number of hours, but that you go through specific training each year for use of force.
And as the training sergeant, do you take on some responsibility for making sure that happens for the officers?
Yes.
How do you do that?
As we go through the year, we have what's called a post roster, where we know what officers attended those trainings, what post board elements are during those trainings, and I have a spreadsheet that I complete with who was there and what they have done through the year. And as we go through the year, we make sure that everyone gets the mandated training.
While there are, are there topics that are mandated to be part of training for peace officers in Minnesota?
Yes.
Okay. If I'm not using the right term, and let me know. Right, like firearm training, you have to have that a certain number of times?
So we're still talking about use of force instruction?
Correct.
Okay. Yes, there are several categories that are specific to different disciplines that we have to teach.
Disciplines is probably the word I should have used. And so even though there are these mandated disciplines, areas, does your department still have some discretion on how that is provided to individual officers?
Yes.
Has Brooklyn Center police department's approach to providing training to officers changed in the years that you've been involved?
Yes.
How so? Explain that to the jury, would you please?
When I first was hired and became an instructor, many of our instructors were kind of trained only in specific disciplines, so they may only want to work in firearms, or they may only want to work in Taser. And as the years went on, I felt that there's a need based on where our industry was going, and the best thing for our department and city is that our instructors were able to cross-train in the other platforms. So when an officer would move from one area where they'd be being trained to another area, we had some commonality of techniques.
And did that also influence how the actual classes were presented, or the trainings were presented to the officers?
Yes.
How did that change?
We would train on those different disciplines, and then as much as we could during our trainings, we would bring those different disciplines into reality-based training.
And what do you mean by reality-based training?
Placing officers under scenarios that are as lifelike as possible in a training environment to provide them with alternatives to solve the scenario in front of them.
And why do you want to do it that way?
So that they have a vast array of responses that they can use when possibly presented with one of these scenarios out in the real world on the street.
So for instance, do you have just a taser class one day where you deal only with tasers?
We do.
But then when you do these scenarios, do they involve only tasers?
No, we want them to be able to utilize as many of the platforms as they can.
And if you would just give the jury an idea of what, a scenario-based training is like.
Sure. It depends on the venue that we have at the time. If it's a building or if it's outside, or we may incorporate vehicles into it. I will bring in generally civilians, some of our civilian staff, to act as participants in it, whether they're victims or witnesses or suspects. And then we would have a script to play. The officer would not know anything about what we were doing until they were given a dispatched call to start that training session. And then they would have to go into the session and work their way through it.
And to the students, if you will, the officers, know what that scenario is about?
No.
And do the actors know what that scenario is about?
My role players?
Correct.
Yes.
And are they given strict direction on what to do and say?
I wouldn't say strict, but some guidelines and where I would like the direction of the scenario to go.
And so is it, what do you do after the scenario is run?
When we conclude the scenario, we come together as a group, the instructors, the officer, and then the role players, and we provide a debrief as much as possible. I try and have the officer debrief the situation on their own so that they can say what went well and what did not go well.
Part of those scenarios involve deciding what level of force to use?
Yes.
Could it involve what weapons to use?
Yes.
And when they do these, would they have a firearm on them?
A firearm that's not capable of firing live rounds. It's a training weapon.
And would they have a taser?
Yes, depending on the platform we were on at the time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we've had different models of Taser product over the years, and some of them were better at doing training than others.
Okay. And would they have like a baton, chemical aerosols, the entire range of what they would wear out on the street?
Yeah, foam baton, inert chemicals, something that would not hurt somebody.
And how often, or what percentage of your trainings involve that type of scenario-based training?
What percentage of that specific training or throughout the year?
Yeah, like throughout the year.
Well, I try and incorporate it into all of our trainings as much as possible.
And so it's been about how long that you've been conducting trainings in that manner?
Well, we've conducted reality-based training for a really long time before I started, encompassing it into as many trainings as we can. Probably started in 2012 or 2013.
So if there is a training where you're not the actual instructor, you've still been familiar with the training plans and what's being taught in that class.
I will have reviewed the lesson plans, correct?
Are you a certified Taser instructor?
Yes.
And does that also mean that you're certified to carry a Taser?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jurors what it means to be a Taser instructor, certified Taser instructor?
How do I become a Taser instructor, or?
Well, yeah, explain to us how you become it and then what it allows you to do.
Okay, so Axon, which is the parent company that sells tasers, they host trainings throughout the country. They have what are called master instructors. Those master instructors hold those classes in every state across the country. You have to attend one of those classes. Their current curriculum has you doing an online study prior to going to a 8-hour practical day where you work with that instructor and other students.
And so what is the purpose of that? When you become a certified instructor, what does it allow you to do?
It allows me to teach end user in the Taser.
And when you say end user, what do you mean?
In our agency, it's a police officer, but it ultimately could be anybody who would be authorized to carry a Taser, a security guard at a hospital, a community service officer at another agency.
So when did you first become certified to carry a Taser?
In 2005,
And when did you become certified as an instructor?
2007.
And have you been a Taser instructor ever since then?
Yes.
How many Taser instructors does the department have now, or typically?
Currently, we have 3, and we've gone with 3 for a really long time.
And when did you first start carrying a Taser for your job?
In 2005.
Does the Brooklyn Center Police Department have a policy on Tasers?
Yes.
And are you familiar with that policy?
Yes.
I'm going to show you and put up on the board Exhibit 334. Do you recognize the policy?
I do.
And the Taser policy requires that a person, that an officer receive training before carrying their Taser, correct?
Correct.
And certification as well, right?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so the training leads to what we call a certification, correct?
Yep, the initial is a certification.
So, and then is there a recertification?
Yes.
So, assume everybody has sort of figured out that the certification is the first time, right? You have to-
Yes.
And then the recertification, how often does that have to happen?
Annually.
And this certification is issued by who? Right? You know what I mean? Where is it? Who certifies you?
The instructor does on behalf of Taser for the organization.
Has opened its programming to include shows created by everyday people just like you who want to teach, talk about, or showcase something of a positive and Christian nature.
So if you would describe for us,
Actor, consultant,
sort of in big picture,
this could be the opportunity.
how Taser training is done.
Your show would air on some of television's most popular platforms.
That's a really broad question.
I'll try and narrow it down. So at the Brooklyn Center Police Department, you've been doing Taser training since at least 2007, correct?
Correct.
So maybe just kind of run us through, like, what does a student, an officer, go through when they attend a Taser training?
Okay, and so it's changed over the years, and the requirements are mandated by Taser themselves of what we have to do. They provide the curriculum, which is a PowerPoint They tell us how many cartridges somebody would have to fire in order to be certified. And over the years, they've set a certain number of hours that we have to spend doing taser training. When we get into a recertification, because tasers have been around for quite a while and we have been carrying them for a long time, we're able to do an annual update, which is, we know that a lot of this stuff has been hashed out for the past 10, 15 years. We're just going to give you the important information that we have right now about the product.
And so there is for taser training, some classroom instruction.
Yes.
That's basically the PowerPoint from Axon.
Yes.
And are there other materials that the students are given at those trainings?
There are.
What are those?
The policy is reviewed.
And which policy do you mean?
Policy 304.
So Brooklyn Center's policy.
Yes.
And that in a classroom type setting?
Yes.
And other documents that are provided to the students, the officers?
Provided or made available, yes.
And where is that?
I won't get their actual names correct, but there's law enforcement warnings, and then if somebody is going to take a voluntary exposure, meaning we use a taser on them in a training scenario, some warnings about what that can do to that person, and they need to consent to having a taser to be used on them during a training session.
And so there is, it sounds like there's a classroom segment of it.
Correct.
And is there something outside of the classroom that is done typically as well?
Yes.
Explain that, please.
The officer has to show proficiency in use of a taser, and that is done by showing how to load a cartridge, how to arm a taser, and how to deploy cartridges from the taser.
And by deploy, you mean actually fire it?
Actually firing it, correct.
So proficiency means learn how to operate it.
Proficiency, yes, and show me that you know how to operate it.
Sort of hands-on.
Yes.
Does that include holstering, drawing, and deploying?
Typically, but not always.
And then are students then also sort of evaluated on their use of the taser through the scenario-based training that you talked about before?
Yes.
At this time, Your Honor, I'm going to offer Exhibit 369.
Any objection to 369? 369 is admitted into evidence, and you may show it.
Do you recognize what's depicted in this exhibit?
I do.
And can you describe for the jurors what that is?
This is a slide from the version 22 PowerPoint that Axon released for 2020.
And this talks about warnings that students have to acknowledge, correct?
Correct.
And so earlier when you testified about sort of the warnings that they have to be provided, that's what this slide is referring to, correct?
Correct.
And is this, well, to be fair, this is it says at the bottom, Axon. I think you said that's the parent company of Taser, correct?
Yes.
So this is would be a slide from one of the PowerPoints that you provide at classes.
Yes.
And so this requirement, the warning acknowledgement, has that been something that has been taught in Taser instruction for quite some time?
Yes.
Is this sort of a standard part of the Taser instruction?
Yes.
This time I'm going to offer Your Honor Exhibit 270.
Okay, 270 will be admitted.
Now, do you recognize what's depicted in Exhibit 270?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jury what this document is?
This document is provided by Taser International Axon, which is the basis or guideline of the PowerPoint that is presented to the end user.
And so is this the warnings you were referring to earlier?
Yes.
And this is provided or made available to students, and this is what they are acknowledging that they have read and understand.
That's not my understanding.
What is your understanding?
When you say sign, what are they signing?
No, that's a very good point. I'm sorry. In the previous slide that we looked at, it talked about acknowledging the warnings, right?
Yes.
And are these the warnings that are provided to them?
Yes.
You looked hesitant.
Well, you said a signature, and on that previous slide, there's no signature. That's why I'm hesitant.
Yep, you're right. No, it was my mistake in using that term. The question really is this: the warnings that students are provided.
Yes.
And if we could just, there you go, that's it. The very top warning box indicates that the taser can temporarily incapacitate a target, correct?
Yes.
And sometimes there's a glare on that screen. You may have to,
Nope, I can see it. I wasn't sure what you were referring to, but I found it now.
I was going to say, very gently move that screen since none of us own it. And then the taser can cause death or serious injury, correct?
Yes.
And that person should obey all warnings, instructions, and all laws and comply with current training materials, right?
Yes.
And if we scroll down, the warning indicates that you complete training first, correct? Do you see that there in number 1?
Yes. Sorry.
And to be candid, this one indicates it's effective May 19th of 2017, right?
Yes.
And is this form pretty consistent with the form of these warnings over many years?
Format, yes.
And this is sort of a summary of the information provided in the class instruction itself. Is that fair?
I would categorize as the PowerPoint as a summary of this document.
Very good. And so if we scroll down a little farther and onto the next page, keep going down if you would, please. Oops. At the top of that page, sorry, you will see preferred target areas, correct?
Yes.
And avoiding sensitive areas, correct?
Yes.
And that's taught in the class as well, is that correct?
Yes.
And all right, you can narrow that down again, please. So in the middle of this page, you'll see a box called secondary injury, correct?
Yes.
And this is a warning about secondary injuries from an uncontrolled movement or fall, correct?
Yes.
And then after that, below it, it goes on to explain that a person needs to, an operator needs to concern themselves with the person's location before using a taser, correct?
Yes.
And below that, there are some examples, and if you go to the top example on the next page, it talks about not to use a taser on a person who is operating or riding any mode of transportation, including a vehicle, correct?
Correct.
So that's one thing that they have to consider, correct?
Yes.
Then we'll go to the top of the next page, please. You'll see a warning box here with 3 separate warnings. And you see that the top one is confusing handgun with CEW. And just for the record, what does CEW mean?
Conducted energy weapon.
And is that a fancy name for taser?
Yes.
And so there's a paragraph here about confusing a handgun with a taser, correct?
Yes.
Has that been a part of your experience working with tasers throughout your career?
Yes.
As a topic that is taught and attention is paid to?
Yes.
And is that then something that is dealt with in taser training?
Yes.
And has it always been a part of taser training?
From the time I've been involved, yes.
At the bottom, under the black bar that says safety information, there's also a paragraph that taser may not work as intended, correct?
Correct.
And so operators have to think sometimes about whether it's going to accomplish its intended result.
Yes.
And if we go on to the next page, there's an acknowledgement there that CEWs are not precision-aimed weapons. Would you agree with that characterization?
I don't see it on the page, but I
That's
would
right.
agree with that.
Okay. So the user also has to consider that they may not hit their target even.
Yes.
And then, I'm sorry, one more thing I want to point out on the next page. The warning in the middle. Number 1, do you see that? What is this is a requirement that an officer safely perform a spark function test before each shift. Is that something that is taught as part of taser training?
Yes.
Is that also required by Brooklyn Center policy?
Yes.
Bear with me just a second. We were talking before about the taser policy, Brooklyn Center's policy. You are familiar with that?
Yes.
And when you teach a training class, you go over this policy with them?
We do.
Do you give them a copy, read it word for word? How do you teach it?
It depends on the training session. Sometimes we read it. Sometimes I read it. Sometimes I have the class read it, taking turns.
And can you go back to Exhibit 334, please? And about halfway down, there's a sentence that starts, members carrying the taser. Do you see that?
Yes.
And is that a requirement for the spark tests that we saw in the mornings? Same kind of thing.
Yes.
And I asked you earlier about this notion of weapons confusion. Has that played a part in how the taser is carried in Brooklyn Center?
Yes.
Can you explain that to the jury, please?
So our policy requires us to carry our taser on the opposite side of our body from that which we carry our firearm.
And has that been policy since you've been carrying a taser in Brooklyn Center?
Since I remember, yes.
Going back to the policy below that, it indicates that it shall be distinctly marked to differentiate it from the weapon, correct?
Correct.
And are there ways that it is distinctive from the firearm?
Yes.
How so?
Color is the main one for our agency that we use, but others in feel, weight.
And are there, well, let me ask you this. Brooklyn Center tasers are bright yellow, correct?
Correct.
Are there tasers that are not bright yellow?
Yes.
Can you buy them in black?
Yes.
Has the department ever done that?
Yes.
Early on?
No. In error.
Okay. So sent them back?
Couldn't.
Really? How are you able to differentiate them then from the firearm?
It was easy when they were in a desk drawer and never came out of it.
Okay. Bad investment maybe, huh?
Yes.
Back to the policy, Exhibit 334. Section 304.4 talks about a verbal warning. Is that part of the training on tasers as well?
Yes.
And what is the purpose of a verbal warning?
There are multiple.
Okay. Can you just describe them for the jury?
One is to alert your partners about your intended actions so that they know that the potential sound is that of a taser and not any other sound. The other is to give the person that you are intending to deploy a taser on a final opportunity to comply.
And so is that part of the training to always provide a verbal warning before using it, deploying it?
When they have a chance, yes.
Okay. And by when you have a chance, you're referring to time there?
Time, or for tactical purposes, it may be better to not tell the person or say, give them a warning. Getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to offer at this time Exhibit 372. Yeah, I'm offering Exhibit 372.
Is there an objection to 372? 372 will be admitted.
Do you kind of recognize where this slide is from?
I have seen it before.
Okay. Is this from Axon or Taser as well?
It's from a Taser PowerPoint, correct?
And so this talks about the decision on where to holster your taser.
So what the
correct?
hell is
Correct.
And
we were talking about?
one is support side, the other dominant side, correct? Does the potential for mistaking a firearm for a taser appear on both sides of this slide?
Yes.
So I was asking you earlier, this is something that has informed practice and training in Brooklyn Center for quite a while.
Yes.
Even though an officer is required to carry their taser on the opposite side of their weapon, correct?
Yes.
Do they have a choice about which direction they use it or holster it?
Yes.
And can you explain the two different choices?
So there's two different holster manufacturers that we currently use, and it depends on how the officer needs to get at the taser as to which one that they prefer to choose.
And so what are the two choices that they can use?
So one is you would draw it out so that I'm right-handed, so my right hand would be grasping it and pulling it out. The other is you'd be using my left hand, my support hand, to draw the taser out and then press it out to the person.
You know what terminology you use for each one?
That I use?
Yeah.
I call one a rock draw and the other one is a straight draw.
Okay. So which one is the rock draw?
Rock draw would be where it rocks out of the holster and then it comes out, where a straight draw comes straight up out of the holster.
Okay. So you wear your taser on your left side and you're right-handed?
Correct.
So you reach around to grab your taser?
Yes.
Which draw is that?
I use a rock draw with my right hand.
And what's the rock part of it? I don't understand.
The taser rocks out of the holster rather than coming straight up out of it, similar to a firearm has to come straight up out of a holster, be able to clear it. This, it rocks forward a little bit to get out of the safety, and then you can just pull it out of the holster.
When you have it in the other orientation, you still have to press a release on the holster,
There's still a safety release on it, yes.
and you still have to move it a certain direction before you pull it out.
More straight up.
Did you bring your Taser 7 with you today?
I did.
And I'm going to ask you to basically describe it for the jury. But before we do that, not a huge lesson in how a taser works, but when a taser is deployed, what is the intended effect that it should have on the body?
It is called neuromuscular incapacitation, and it's where the electricity interferes with the body's systems to engage all of the muscles into like a locked up scenario, and then also creates a little bit of pain.
And so it does this to the body how? You know what I mean? What comes out of the taser that causes that?
Electricity.
And shoots two barbs, correct?
Correct.
And when you are deploying a taser, is there a preferred way to make sure that that happens as it should, incapacitating neuromuscularly?
Well, we have our preferred target zones.
Okay. And what are those?
On the front of a person, you want to engage them below the rib cage, avoiding any sensitive areas. And then on the back, anywhere from the neck down. The back being the preferred target if it's available.
And Your Honor, I'm going to offer Exhibit 376.
Any objection to 376? 376 will be admitted.
Daunte, you want to do it?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, that my notes are just horrible. But let's talk about this while we can. 376 is talking about authorized use, when to use it, correct?
No.
I'm sorry, what is Exhibit 376 about?
What says CW should not be used on individuals.
And so this says it should not be used on individuals who are passively resisting and are not an immediate threat of flight risk, correct?
Correct?
And has some other circumstances in which it should not be used.
Correct?
Right. Now, the second page of this also talks about the preferred target zones, correct? So you can scroll down to the next page.
Yes.
And you recognize this as a slide from a Taser PowerPoint.
Yes.
And so the green areas on the front are the preferred areas, correct?
Correct.
And the next page and on the back, the indication is to reduce cardiac risk, problems with the heart, should target the back area, correct?
Yes.
That's not going to make you do that.
And when you deploy a taser, is there something that you want with regard to how far apart the probes are?
Yeah, the optimal spread between the two probes would be 12 inches.
And if you don't get that kind of spread, what happens?
If you're too close, you can end up with nothing more than what we call pain compliance. It does not induce neuromuscular incapacitation. If you get further than that, you still have a really good likelihood of getting neuromuscular incapacitation, but the chances of you getting both probes on something diminishes.
Young Pharaoh's doing is two different things.
And I'm going to offer at this time, Your Honor, 374.
Any objection to 374? 374 will be admitted.
And this is what I was referring to earlier.
Young Pharaoh seemed a little bipolar.
This is part of training as well, and reflecting that warning that we talked about earlier.
No, you don't.
To not deploy a taser on somebody who is
Hold on.
operating vehicle or machinery.
What up, man?
Is that correct?
Yes.
What's going on with you?
All right. Now I said I was going to ask you to show us your taser, and what I would like to do, Sergeant Peterson, if you would, and I'm going to offer Exhibit 370 and 371.
Any objections to 370 and 371? Those exhibits will be admitted into evidence.
And I would ask you to, put up 370, please.
I said, you don't fuck with me no more.
And do you recognize this as the basic Taser 7,
Yes.
similar to one you have today?
Yes.
Do that what?
And does this have
So you're not in Jordan no more?
a trigger?
Yes.
Does it have a safety switch?
Yes.
And a front sight?
Yes.
And if we go to 371,
Wait.
this is a close-up of the safety switch, correct?
Correct.
Can you describe for the jurors, how this safety switch works?
California?
The safety is linked from the left side to the right side, so you cannot move it independently from side to side. When it is down, it is in a safe, unarmed position. When you push it up, it is now in an armed position. and it activates many internal logging features to happen.
And
And it's kind of late in the afternoon, and I think if you take the stand up and stretch your legs.
Say good time back.
Okay.
I don't know that though. I didn't do my pants, but they don't even know they call me because they're like, oh, well, you coming?
Okay. All right, you may be seated. I'm sorry, you may continue.
So can I ask you a question?
so
That whole
when
conversation that you have.
you move the
about
safety
this,
switch
this way.
up, does it essentially turn on the taser?
Yes.
And what changes are visible in the taser then once
But I
the
say, if
safety
you
switch
want to
is
act this
moved
way,
up?
what was that conversation about?
In our department, we have the lasers and the flashlight or illumination turned on.
And when you say lasers, how many lasers come out of it?
On a Taser 7-2
Okay, so
And what
what's
is
your
the
decision?
purpose of those
Or just come up
lasers?
one.
to give the user a general idea of where the top probe and the bottom probe are going to go.
And
Huh?
and the flashlight probably speaks for itself, right? Is that yes?
Yes.
And so when you do that, when you arm it, and is there also a screen in the back of the taser that provides some information?
Yes.
And that is visible to the person holding the taser?
It is.
It provides information about the operation of the
Oh, I
taser?
ain't give
The
it back to you?
Okay,
status of it.
status, good.
I ain't give you that same
Did previous
feedback.
models of the taser that your department used have a safety switch?
Yes.
Do you recall how far back the tasers were that had safety switches that you used?
Everything from the X26 and the X26P, which are the ones that I was trained in and how to use since 2005.
If we can go back to 370, please. I started out a while ago talking to you about the spark function test, is that right?
A function test, yes.
And policy requiring that that be done every shift.
Should be done, yes.
So you said the
And
relationship.
is the button that you use for that depicted here on Exhibit 370
Yes.
labeled arc switch?
Yes.
All right. You can press it. What I would like to have you do, Sergeant Peterson, and if you want to stand up and show the jury, walk us through the process of how a spark function test would be done at the beginning of a shift for an officer with the Taser 7. And then I'm going to ask you to operate the spark function test. Now, can that be done safely here?
Right,
in the
because you
court?
didn't tell me.
Yes.
And so if you could, like I said, just walk us through the process and show the jury how that's done.
Okay. It's going to depend on the day. If I'm just coming on to shift, I may have to get some equipment out of our armory and then assign it to myself. Once I have done that, I may holster it, or I may just go right into my spark test. So I carry my
So is
taser
it
on my left side.
That a relationship to draw, or is it from
As I draw it, I'm going to press both arc switches, one on the left side, one on the right side at the same time. It now eliminates my CAD, tells me that I'm in a function test mode. I can then turn on my taser. My CAD has changed colors. I know that it's now in a function test mode. And now I simply press my arc switch again. It runs through a 5-second spark test. While it's doing that on the CID, it's counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the duration of a cycle that we want somebody to end at. I check the status of it again, I disarm it, and I holster it.
Thank you. Now, before we move on, I want to just go back to the policy briefly. If we can go back to Exhibit 334. And I want to go to the second page, starting at use of the Taser device. Taser has limitations and restrictions, correct?
Yes.
And we've talked a little bit about those in general. And I assume those limitations and restrictions are part of Taser training, correct?
Yes.
And again, here at the bottom of that same paragraph, an awareness that the device may not achieve the intended results, correct?
Correct.
And that refers to may not achieve neuromuscular incapacitation, correct?
Correct.
And 304.5.1, the next paragraph, is Brooklyn Center's policy regarding the use of the Taser in circumstances in which it could be used, correct?
Correct.
And it talks about a subject who is violent or physically resisting, correct, is one of them?
Yes.
And the other is demonstrated by words or action an intent to be violent or to physically resist and appears to present potential harm to officers, himself, or others, correct?
Yes.
And then the sentence under that, mere flight without other known circumstances or factors is not good cause, correct?
Correct.
So that is one part of the policy that officers have to consider.
Yes.
The following paragraph, 304.5.2, special deployment considerations. Certain individuals, it should be avoided unless the totality of circumstances indicates, correct?
Correct.
And the last paragraph, F, is those who are in a position or activity that may result in collateral injury. And it references in the example paragraph operating vehicles, correct?
Correct.
So this is something that officers have to consider as well when
Yeah.
deploying. I'm sorry.
Yes.
And this is consistent with the training thing we looked at earlier.
The Taser training?
Yes.
Yes.
If you can go to the next page, 304.5.3 discusses targeting considerations there, correct?
Yes.
And that's consistent with the training that we talked about as well.
Yes.
On page 304. The following page, 304.9, it's a repetition of the training requirement, correct? I think you have to go back up a page up. Right, they have to complete training before they can carry, correct?
Correct.
And then on the next page, the first full paragraph requires proficiency training. That's what we've already talked about.
Yes.
And below that, there's a reference to the training sergeant being responsible for, among other things, at trainings, a review of the policy, correct?
Yes.
A review of the use of force policy. Right?
Yes.
And that's the general use of force policy, correct?
Yes.
Is the use of a taser the use of force?
Can you repeat?
Is the use of a taser the use of force?
A use of force?
Yes.
Yes.
And training also requires performing reaction hand draws or cross draws to reduce the possibility of accidentally drawing and firing a firearm.
Correct.
So that's something that is, by policy, part of the training as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay, members of the jury, we're going to take our afternoon break, okay? So it'll be 20 minutes. The officer, you may step down. Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Tim Blotz here in the Fox 9 newsroom for our continuing streaming coverage of the trial against Kim Potter for the death of Daunte Wright in that traffic stop back on April 11th of this year. Joining me now is Paul Bloom, who's been reporting on this trial all along. The judge has taken a quick break here this afternoon. We've only been back about an hour and 15 minutes, and if you've been listening in, it would appear to me, Paul, that maybe some of the jurors have been drifting off. About 10 minutes ago, she took a break here in court, asking the jury to stand up and stretch their legs. And I'll be honest, I've covered a lot of courts in the past, a lot of trials in the past. I've never seen that happen. And now she just abruptly called a quick break here today. I get the impression, without being in the courtroom, there might be a little drifting going on there against in the middle of some rather tedious testimony about department policy.
Yeah, to steal a baseball analogy there, I kind of felt that was a seventh inning stretch there during the witness questioning. I think maybe hearing that taser, the spark test in there may have woken some people up, but certainly unusual, especially interrupting the middle of Matthew Frank's questioning. The prosecutor, while it may be tedious, maybe a little boring from afar, but Matthew Frank's, has a rhythm going, and he's asking his witness about policy. He wants to go through and then interrupted by the judge to get them to stand up. As you talk about dozing off, just one observation I had yesterday during my time in the courtroom where I could eyeball the jury across the room. I did note one of the jurors dozing off. He was struggling late in the morning. I noticed in the afternoon he had a Diet Coke with some caffeine in it on his jury desk. I did note also today in one of the pool notes that same juror was struggling to stay awake in the early morning session. So, judge is obviously cognizant of that. She wants this jury focused. They, of course, have big jobs to do, and they do have to consume all of this. And it is a lot. It's been emotional at times. It is heavy testimony. And obviously, the way the state is building the case requires some deep focus and attention, and that they are just building it very broadly. Here are our policies. Here is the oath. Here's what she's supposed to do. We learned yesterday she was not testing her taser every day. And that is department policy, to fire it up, both to make sure it's working. And I also think, although it hasn't really been testified to, it gives that officer the opportunity to feel it, to see how it comes out of that holster every day. And we've learned she did not follow that policy. Now, what I'll be watching for this afternoon is cross-examination for this police sergeant, because other officers who have testified, when pressed about the use of force at the scene, the defense is arguing it was an accident, it was a mistake, but they have argued under the facts that they knew it, that Officer Potter was authorized to use force. And I will now, a good time to bring in our legal analyst here, Marsh Hallberg Criminal Defense, a longtime criminal defense attorney, as well as a prosecutor. City Attorney of Edina, if I remember correctly. Marsh, thank you for joining us. And Marsh, I would just, start off with kind of just what we just witnessed in court, was this idea that the judge asked the jury to stand up, to stretch their legs, and then went into a break a few minutes later. I noted to Tim while you were joining us that, in some respects, she cut off Matt Frank in the middle of his rhythm of questioning. Is that just sort of a boring time in court, and that's something the judge needs to do from time to time?
Pretty common for them to have everybody stretch their legs. They'll even tell jurors when the trial starts that if you have a bad back or you have issues that you just need to address, you can certainly stand even during a trial, even while testimony is going on, if you just need to do it for physical reasons. So, let's be honest about this. This was kind of some of the boring stuff, right? I mean, it wasn't the most exciting stuff we've seen, but it's important in a sense to put it forward. But I think the concern we have here, Paul and Tim, is that just like we saw this morning, is that by the time the cross is done with this witness, we're going to think it's a defense witness. They're going to go into all the issues of use of force, that she's an excellent person, that she did all of her training, that granted she may have not tested the taser a few times, but in the long run, that's really not the core issue here. So I think it's going to be, at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a defense day, even though it's the state's
day to present witnesses.
Well, Marsh, you just hit on something there that crossed my mind when they asked the officer here, the sergeant, to do the test on the taser. She's not being charged for not testing her taser. So how does that build into the foundation then of what the prosecution is trying to do?
Not much, and I think she did even test it. Didn't she, Tim? The 2 days before this incident, she had tested it. I think it was days before that. So you do the same thing, by the way, when you go out on your test for when you're running radar for testing for speeding tickets. You know, you go out on you have a log. You do that every time too. So it's not the only thing you kind of do as a daily check. I don't think it's worth much, really. I just don't. I guess trying to think where it's going, it shows a sloppiness by her and indifference. Kind of, I've done this a million times. I can be cavalier, and her cavalierness led to her grabbing the wrong handle, the wrong weapon.
Your thoughts there, Marsh. My quick takeaway, again, I know it's just a test, is it working that day, but also, as I mentioned to Tim, just the idea of handling it. I know we haven't necessarily heard that testimony, but it would give that officer, who doesn't, she's acknowledged she's never used her gun, she's never used her taser in the line of duty, just to give an officer the feel of pulling it each and every day and firing it up. And if you had done it a few hours before you make this traffic stop, maybe it's a little bit more familiar to you as opposed to this slip activity where up and then draws her gun. I have to believe at some point the state has a cop who is going to stand their ground on this idea of the use of force was justified in that moment. If anyone's going to do it, it's got to be Sergeant Peterson here, the use of force trainee. They know where Earl Grey is going. They have put him on the stand today. They didn't have to bring in more policy initiatives. I have to believe at some point a cop on cross-examination will stand up and sort of speak to maybe an excessive use of force in the field and in that moment. But you're convinced, Marsh, in the end, a guy will flip and we'll be talking about a defense witness by the end of this?
Not for this guy. I think, well, we'll see. I think the whole expert use of force person is a little different animal in that it's a paid expert. That's a little different. I think they'll end with that strong person. I think we're going to end probably with the state by tomorrow, don't you think? So they plan on that. And any expert you give also, you have to give a summary of their testimony. So the state and defense have to know what the other experts are going to conclude or tell. So the defense already knows that and they'll prepare for that. I think your last point was a really good one, Paul, that you and Tim had about some of the issues that she wasn't as familiar with it had she continued to use it every day. Potter will take the stand. We know that. There are going to be some hits she takes because they're going to go through this. Officer Potter isn't true. This is a different color. It's a different weight. It's in a different place on your belt. It's got this charge up time. It's got the 2 dots that appear, blah, blah, blah. It's going to go through all those. And despite all that, despite all your training, and despite your pledge to protect and serve, you still did this, didn't you? Right. So that's the kind of cross I expect.
Marsh, Tim here, getting along some of the line of questioning so far, my observation has been, and I'm curious to know yours, that Matthew Frank has been very careful in how he's questioning Sergeant Peterson with regards to the use of force policy as to not allow Earl Grey to go back on cross-examination to go over any of the sections to open him up to become an effective defense witness. What's your observation?
Just like we talked about, Tim, this morning about that, outside the scope, that a cross-examination can't talk about topics that weren't covered on the direct examination. If you want to cover that topic with a witness, you have to recall them to do that. But again, it's a trial, it's not an evidence class, so I expect Mr. Grey or Mr. Ing to say to this witness something to the effect of, wouldn't you have shot this person anyway, or whatever it would have been, right? Some kind of question. It'll be objected to, even if it's sustained and the person is not allowed to answer the question. The jury heard the question, and they know the defense wanted to ask that question of the witness, so they will score points for that, even if the answer doesn't come out. They've already got it out there through a couple of people.
So stand by to stand by is what you're saying.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. That's kind of fun may be the wrong word. We're dealing with people's lives, but the real challenge and excitement to be a trial lawyer is that you really have to think on your feet quickly, and it's a real challenging career.
And Marsh, I have a question. You kind of talked about the eventual cross-examination, the difficult questions Kim Potter will face. We haven't asked you this question. It was picked up on body camera. Those who've tuned in have certainly seen the body camera footage from the various angles of the officers at the Daunte Wright traffic stop. And in the moment, in the immediate aftermath, Kim Potter is heard on the video saying, "I am going to prison." At some point, she's going to be grilled on that. I've asked other experts about it. You're joining us for the first time during this trial. She's caught in the moment saying something like that. I would imagine she'll be grilled on that. You know, you're a police officer. How did you know you're going to go to prison in the immediate aftermath? You knew you did something illegal. You knew you did something wrong. How worried are you in terms of that that statement being uttered and that it's captured on body camera? Would you anticipate her having to dance around an answer on that topic?
That's one of those questions, Paul, that I would have asked my client many times over and over to practice my answer to that. And again, you can almost write it out exactly, and you would work with her on it. And my answer, if I had off the cuff right now, say what would be my answer, I would like Officer Potter to say if I was her attorney. I would want her to say something like, "I know what's going on in the world around us, and I'm afraid that people won't take the time to learn that my case is different from other cases that have gotten worldwide publicity. And everybody's going to jump to conclusion, and they're going to have their own thoughts and won't take the time to learn the facts."
Marsh, I'm curious to know what direction do you think the questioning will take yet this afternoon of Sergeant Peterson?
Well, like I said, if you follow your thought, which is a good one, keep it simple, stupid, right? That you just narrow this down, that you've covered this, that it really shouldn't be much more than we've already covered. I think you deal with the facts are kind of out there. You finish it up with the use of force experts saying it was not a reasonable use, that you're trained to pressure situations to not react in the wrong way, that she did. That was reckless. It was intentional. It was negligence. It was very negligent, given all of her years of training and importance of the decision. And that's what they're going to hang it on. And they will argue that to a jury, to bring it home at the end, that this isn't about whether Ms. Potter is a nice person. And it isn't about that the law is blind to that the court can factor those things into any sentencing. That this is about whether she committed a crime. And that's the angle they'll take.
As we kind of wrap up and we think we're getting close to the end of the state case here, I would just point out to our viewers, we do expect one last spark of life witness on the stand. Daunte Wright's dad has basically been waiting in the wings for his moment. There have been motions to the effect that he is not sequestered. He can be in the courtroom. I haven't seen much of him at the trial in the courtroom itself, but we do know the state did say in a motion that they expect him at the end of witness testimony, and thus when you kind of, we assess the case at all of these breaks, each and kind of plodding along, but at some point the case, you kind of look at it in its totality, which we kicked off the state case with the emotional testimony of mom, Katie Wright, Katie Bryant, if you will, on the witness stand, the emotion she brought to it, the loss of her son. And then my understanding is the state intends to bookend that testimony with dad yet to come. And that might give this jury a little bit of a kick after a couple of defeats on sort of police testimony. And I would just point that out. But in the end, when Aubrey Wright takes the stand, he'll very much be limited, right, Marsh, by law, by the way the courts work in terms of what he can testify to. He's going to just put a human emotion on the loss of his 20-year-old son, correct?
Yeah, and that's a really good way to put it, the bookends, because the state wants, again, your case, right? You want to start and finish strongly. And in this case, that's going to be very emotional. He'll cry, they'll show us some very emotional pictures of Mr. Wright, and that'll be a real strong way to finish by him. And the general thought is, when I've done these trials, you don't mess with spark of life. You don't challenge somebody that's dead about being a good person or bad person. Now, this defense was very aggressive here and said that they want to put in a photograph, I think, of Mr. Wright holding a gun into a camera, right? Some picture that appeared on the internet somewhere. And they might have just put that in and said no further questions, right? Because a lot of times you just don't ask any questions on spark of life. You let them, you take the hit on that and you go on. And that's where you try to counter that, just like we just talked about how the state will talk about. It doesn't matter whether this officer is a nice person or not. The same thing will be here, is that the defense can up in closing and say, Mr. Wright's life had value, he was loved by many, you
$950.
know, the loss is great. That again is not a reason to convict Ms. Potter, so we'll just try to reverse that.
And I come get you. Would you leave?
You know, take that emotion out of it.
And Marsh, before Daunte's father takes the stand, we fully expect there to be an expert witness or two to testify in this trial. Given what has happened to the prosecution today in terms of motions rulings and some of the testimony so far, especially in the last day and a half here, how important are those expert witnesses going to be to the prosecution, and what is Matt Frank going to have to ask them to try and prove their case of first and second degree manslaughter here?
So I think we all agree that so far the state has had a really difficult time trying to show that it wasn't reasonable to use a firearm, let alone a taser. So if she made the mistake, it's okay in the sense that she could have shot him anyway. So I think that state expert finally has to be the one who kind of comes in and say, look, I'm the expert on this. And they'll go through all the background and the training and why they deal with this in real life, these scenarios that have already been talked about today, trying to recreate the emotion of the moment. And he'll say that it wasn't reasonable. And he's testified in other cases. He's been a big expert. He's studied all these different treatises and other profiles of cases, all this basis that I have that other people don't have, and try to build credibility on it. Mm-hmm. But again, then we expect in the defense, right, we'll throw on their expert, and I would get up and in a conversational way in closing go, you got two experts. One says it happened in a proper way, the other says it didn't. We kind of cancel each other out. Let's look at everything else.
But I think
in a tie, the defense wins.
I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't necessarily have a question. I would just ask Marsh at this point. I know we're kind of jumping ahead and kind of all over the place. With the state wrapping up its case, we think, in the next day or so, my question is, you see it sometimes when the state's done, the defense will rise and ask the judge, I forget what it's exactly called, but basically a summary judgment that the state hasn't proved its case. It would be a very high bar to jump over, but you're not at the point where you think the judge could ever say at the end of the state case, we're not continuing, you failed to live up to even proving man one or man two, do you? You don't think we're there? And could you explain that process in the legal system that the defense often does and ask the judge for a ruling even before the defense begins its own case?
Well, we have two kinds of law systems, right? We have civil cases and we have criminal cases. Civil cases are about money and contracts and everything other than criminal law, where you're either going to jail. Those are between two different parties. And in summary judgment, which you can argue at any point in a case, can be early on or even before the case goes to trial, you can argue, even if everything the one side says is true, it's still not enough for them to win. And so that's a summary judgment action that you have in a civil lawsuit. In a criminal case, it's kind of the same thing like you just said. We call it a motion for judgment of acquittal. And we just basically making the same thing. Judge, everything they say is true. There's no way that a jury can convict in this case. They haven't met their burden even remotely, and therefore it shouldn't happen. That's not happening here. Judge is going to let it go to the jury.
Understood. Understood. So we'll get back into Sergeant Peterson's testimony here. We're waiting for the afternoon break to wrap up. And then, of course, we anticipate probably another Earl Grey cross-examination. Marsh, just as we kind of reassess today thus far, the state taking away some points, correct?
Yeah, this is a state's game. And despite that, the defense has scored an awful lot of hits on this, and that's because this is a hard case. And the state's had a challenge since the beginning, tried to build this into a plausible argument, at least on the manslaughter 1 charge. It's a lot harder than manslaughter 2. And again, I think at the end you're going to be left with a strong feeling of Ms. Potter testifying. She'll probably be the last witness for the defense, I assume. She'll be very personable and kind. Two ways to go with that strategy on the defense side. You can put in all of the supporting witnesses to testify about her character, and she's a great person. You do all those things and go, then here's Ms. Potter, kind of a thing. So you do it all that way, build up to her. And the other way is you put her on early, and then everybody else comes after her. And they're kind of hard to cross-examine. Here's how I know Ms. Potter. She's a great person. it's kind of hard to attack that really. So
Is that easy or
either
hard?
strategy is a common one to go with, whether she's before or after that.
Is
I
that
generally
easy or
like her
hard?
after because she's the one person that gets to sit in the courtroom the whole time and hear everybody.
Is that
So
easy
she can kind of
or
piece
hard?
everything together at the end. So I'd rather have her then. Again, assuming you think she's going to be a witness, good witness. I think she will be a good witness.
All right, I want to reset the stage here a little bit. We're coming up now in 3:21 Central Time here in Minneapolis, and Judge Regina Chu has taken a 20-minute break here in the afternoon testimony. It somewhat appeared, and we're not in the courtroom here, so we have the same view that you do of the courtroom, but it kind of would appear that maybe some of the jurors were starting to drift off a little bit, and the testimony has been pretty tedious, going over department policy and the use of tasers and use of force, going through those policies line by line and showing it up. About a half an hour ago, she asked the jury to stand up, stretch their legs a little bit without referencing what was happening, and then about 10 minutes after that, she decided, let's just take a break for 20 minutes. We're coming back upon that time right now. On the stand has been the second witness for the day. His name is Sergeant Mike Peterson. He's with the Brooklyn Park Police Department, and he's been going over line by line on that use of force and the taser policies that they have with the department. I see Judge Regina Chu is now back on the bench, so let's take you back into the courtroom.
Oh, had to. 8-0. One circle. Roswell Road.
Okay, please be seated. Mr. Frank, can you continue?
Give me a second, babe. Let me call a check system. Let me call you right back.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sergeant Peterson, thank you. I wanted to ask you, when you are putting together a training, when you complete a training, do you always save in the department's records every record of that training, every piece of paper used for that training?
Every piece of paper, no.
And have you, but does the department then keep track of every training that has been attended?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk about these PowerPoints and these presentations that are made at the training. And so to do that, I'm going to start with Exhibit 388. Well, actually, before we start doing that, we had discussed a little bit about the holster, correct?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you
Available at checksystems.com, where we offer several self-serve options.
what has been received into evidence as Exhibit 380. May I approach the witness?
Submitting your personal information to check systems to acknowledge your agreement to provide accurate identifying information and your understanding that check systems may access, store, and use this information to the extent permitted by law. When requesting information from check systems, you may obtain information on yourself and your transactions. Obtaining information from a consumer reporting agency under false pretenses is a federal offense. If you're calling for someone other than yourself, say someone
And
what can I help
do you recognize what that is?
You can
I
say,
do.
And we have received testimony that that is the taser taken from Ms. Potter after this incident. Is that what you recognize it as, the Taser 7 holster? I'm sorry, did I say taser?
If you dispute the completeness or
That is the
accuracy of
holster taken from Ms. Potter after this incident.
to submit a dispute directly to the source of the information.
It looks like a holster that we would have issued, yes.
And is that the same as your holster that you currently are using?
Similar.
How is it different?
This would, as it sits on a belt, rock to the rear, rather than how I have mine, it would rock to the front.
You'd like to speak with a representative.
And what I'm wondering if you can do, if your taser would fit into that holster,
Okay?
and if you could demonstrate to the jury by placing your holster, your taser in that holster, and then demonstrating how it would be taken out of the holster to use.
Do you want me to stay seated or stand up?
Probably easier to stand up, I think.
Okay.
My name's Steve. I'm in Houston.
Yes, Steve, how you doing? My name is Daunte Jackson, and I finally received my
Well, first, tell us what you're doing as you're doing it, please.
So there's a safety release button here, which merely takes a piece of plastic out from the trigger area, allowing the taser to rock straight to the rear. And then it won't go any further than that. Now I can acquire a grip and I can just pull it out.
And so, once you let that switch go, how much do you have to move it to get it out of the holster?
Inch and a half.
But you can't pull it straight out, you do move it a little.
Last name Jackson, J-A-C-K-S-O-N.
All right, thank you. All right, may I approach again?
212-927-0003.
I just want the information. The first thing is large B is a delta, B is an alpha, I is B, C is a zebra, the last name is Jackson, it's J-A-C-K-S-O-N.
All right, now, if I could, I would offer Exhibit 388.
Right? Thank you for providing the required information. Please tell me some
And is it admitted into evidence?
And I would like to show you the first page of Exhibit 388.
Sir, I have. Yeah.
Do you recognize what this is?
Yeah, I'm looking at what
I
y'all
do.
sent me.
And
This is
is this the
totally
first page of
wrong.
a Taser training PowerPoint?
It is.
And what I've done, and this is a rather lengthy PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
And I'm going to jump from slide to slide so that we can kind of speed this along, all right?
Say that again?
And when you talk about a PowerPoint, so everybody knows this is sort of a presentation that you
0685.
put up on a screen for everybody to see,
R-O-U-N.
correct?
Yes.
And you can also print it and provide a paper as well.
Yes.
So this one is from 2016. This was in the records of the 2016 training records, and that's consistent with the date on the first slide here, true?
Yes.
Now I'm going to go to slide 2,
Thank you for providing all the
Yes, sir.
information.
and this indicates what the goal is, correct?
Yes.
And that's to reasonably safely and effectively operate the taser, correct?
Yes.
And if we go to slide 4, here again is instruction that every participant must receive, fully read, and understand the taser warnings, correct?
Correct.
I know you mentioned earlier a release. Does every student have to sign a release?
Yes.
Okay. I thought it was only people that subjected themselves to a voluntary exposure.
Let's start with the address.
That was the warnings that I was speaking about, but on these form that we use to track that training, they're also signing a release to hold Taser liable for any injuries that occurs while they're being trained in Taser.
2590.
But this here again is another
Unit 7.
slide about
College Park.
the warnings being provided to the participants, correct?
Correct.
And if we can go to slide 4.
2637.
Sorry,
Yes,
it was already there.
Bill.
That is slide 4. Can we go to slide 8?
E is in
please?
Paul. E is in Edward. Bill.
8-Ville Road,
And
apartment 41B.
this
Atlanta, Georgia.
slide talks about disclaimers.
I did live
Each
there.
agency is responsible for creating its own use of force policy, correct? And so this is why you go over the
Yeah,
policy,
it's H.
Brooklyn Center
H
policy,
is in Harry.
Yes.
and
H is in Harry. A
at the
is in
bottom,
Alpha. B is in Paul. E is in
CEWs
Zell-
are serious weapons
B
and
is
are to
in
be treated
Victor.
as such,
I
correct?
is in Intel.
Is that
L is
stressed
in
to
Lilo. L is in Lilo.
participants?
E is in
Yes.
Echo.
And a taser is not a substitute for deadly force. What does that mean?
That if you need to use deadly force, you should probably use a instrument that would meet the needs of deadly force.
That was my mom.
Because a taser alone
That was
would
my
not
mom.
necessarily be deadly force.
Not necessarily.
69.
Can cause death, but not
Certainly can.
And then to slide 10,
All right. That's what a phone.
a person must complete the entire curriculum,
443
correct?
769 58.
That's been true for all the taser trainings you've been involved in.
As far as I'm aware.
Slide 12,
Wait a minute. What? None of these numbers.
directing everybody to make sure that the safety switch is off, correct?
Yes.
And slide 13,
My number is 404
lasers must not be pointed at the eyes, so we know,
7986.
at least as far back as 2016, the tasers you had safety switches and lasers, correct?
Yes.
Slide 14. Here again is a now familiar
79.
screen about warnings for the taser, correct?
Yes.
And here you are to distribute, review, and understand, at least a reminder to do that, the taser product warnings, correct?
Source of information. I think financial.
Slide
training,
15,
I never.
and again, making the materials, or giving them to those who attend the training, correct?
Correct.
This is also a part of all the taser trainings that you're familiar with?
And
Yes.
I never had
All right.
an
Slide
encounter
24.
with silly destruction.
So voluntary
Address
exposure.
is 8102
I
Webb
think
Road.
you mentioned that earlier. It's when somebody agrees to be.
And 133
Shot
Trinity
with a taser,
Avenue.
correct?
I never
Correct.
went there.
Have you ever volunteered for that?
I have.
How many times have you volunteered for that?
Once.
Why only once?
Yes.
Didn't want to feel it again?
And so that's a voluntary exposure,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
And that's not required as part of the training.
Yes.
When it does happen, and if we go to slide 29, voluntary exposures require 2 spotters, is that right?
Yes.
Why is that?
Yes.
To reduce the risk of injury when the person falls.
If we can go to slide 41.
I wouldn't do this.
This is an illustration of the Taser X20. Is that the model you were using in 2016?
Yes.
And that's why you would have this particular PowerPoint, because that's the one you were using.
Correct.
And that also as well had a flashlight and a laser, correct?
Correct.
And slide 42, please. Indicates that model had a safety switch and a CID screen, the information display at the back also.
Yes.
Slide 44. This slide indicates similar way to operate the safety switch as the current model, correct?
Correct.
In slide 49. That's that CID screen, very similar to the one that you have on you today, correct?
Similar.
And slide 61. And this screen is about a spark or function test, correct?
Correct.
So is that a requirement for people operating a taser even back in 2016 for this, when this presentation occurred?
Not a requirement.
How do you mean?
It says should be conducted.
All right. So it was a recommendation from Taser,
Correct.
and your policy would have required it in 2016?
It mirrored it, saying it should be conducted.
Slide 87. This is instruction on using minimum force necessary to accomplish objectives, correct?
Yes.
And only those actively resisting, right?
Yes.
Also, the training here to give a verbal warning before the use, correct?
Correct.
And then the next slide, 88. Again, giving subjects an opportunity to comply before force is used. That's part of the warning, as you indicated earlier.
Yes.
Slide 89. And this is the targeting guidelines, correct?
Yes.
And the targeting guidelines in 2016, the same areas of the body as we went over previously?
I'm not sure.
Okay, fair enough. Slide 91. So the smart use considerations, can you describe what those are? What aspect of the training these refer to? My question is really more about this portion of the training that they refer to as smart use considerations. Is it more tactical or practical?
Yeah, it's taking the totality of the circumstances of the situation in front of them, whether it's in a reality-based training scenario or out on the street, and making appropriate decisions.
Okay. And if we can go to slide 98. So again, to reduce cardiac risks, is there a concern about the heart when a taser is deployed?
Sure. There is.
And what is that?
There have been instances where it's been reported that the taser has caused cardiac failure in people. According to the research I've seen, it's inconclusive, but just to be sure, we want to try and keep electricity away from the heart to minimize that if possible.
And so this is part of the concept of targeting, correct?
Correct.
And slide 108, please. And this is a slide about the pros and cons of which side you carry your taser in the holster.
Correct.
Similar to the one we looked at previously.
Yes.
So this was presented during the 2016 class as well.
I can't say for sure.
Why not?
I don't know what version of the PowerPoint this is. If this is the user course, if this is an annual research course.
So this is from your training records. So it would be one that you had.
But we could have hired new officers and they could have gone through the initial course. We would have done a recertification or annual research for officers. So I can't say specifically when this was presented.
But certainly this is part of the training on which side to holster.
For this PowerPoint.
Okay. A concept that was certainly known to officers in 2016, whether it's this taser presentation or not, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And by that I mean weapons confusion.
Yes.
And slide 114, please. So again, this is about targeting, right?
Yes.
So that was a concept that was taught as far back as 2016, correct?
Yes.
And 116. And here again, seeing the same sort of target area, back is preferred, correct?
Yes.
When practical, practicable, I guess is the word, correct?
Correct.
And 117. If the front is targeted, it should be the lower abdomen, correct?
Correct.
And there is a reference here to split the belt line. What does that mean?
It references how the body is made up of two different nerve bundles, one that controls the upper body, one that controls the lower body. The two different hemispheres, which is kind of at the belt line, is where you can engage both of those. So even if you are at a close distance, if you can get probe spread above the belt line and below the belt line, you are more likely to have neuromuscular incapacitation.
When the probes come out of the taser, do they come out at different angles or different angles from the taser itself?
Yes,
Why is that?
to give spread between the two different probes.
So the farther you are away from the subject, the more spread you'll get.
Correct.
And so you want to be a certain distance away from the subject to get the best probe spread. Is that the proper way of saying it?
Best probe spread, among other things, yes.
Slide 119, please. And that's what's explained here. Correct?
Yes.
On slide 120. This is the explanation of neuromuscular incapacitation, correct?
Yes.
And slide 131. Some causes of limited effectiveness. So this was a topic of training, at least in this one or other trainings as far back as 2016 at least, correct?
Yes.
And loose or thick clothing could be one of the circumstances that affect effectiveness.
Yes.
Slide 150, please. Again, the recognition back in 2016 that the taser may not achieve the intended results, correct?
Correct.
And slide 155, please. So back then, the recommendation was the preferred range is 7 to 15 feet, correct?
Correct.
And is that still essentially true?
A little bit farther off with the current taser product that we carry.
And what do you mean a little further off?
Generally, we want to be between 10 and 12 feet.
And slide 168.
Yes.
Now, this indicates you can go hands-on with the subject. What does that mean?
It's recommended that we try and restrain the person that is being tased during the tasing to reduce the need to administer additional rounds or cycles of the taser or other force options becoming necessary.
And can a person who goes hands-on receive some of the electrical shock from the taser?
Yes.
How does that happen?
Electricity travels the path of least resistance.
So if you put your hands in that path,
It will go into your body.
slide 205, please.
Yes.
This refers to non-firing drills. You were training back in 2016. What is this referring to, non-firing drills?
This would refer to being able to put a cartridge onto the taser, take the cartridge back off, you can manipulate the safety, perform a spark test.
So the proficiency things you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
And then 206, please. Firing drills, would those have been done as well in this training in 2016?
Yes.
And 207, please.
Right.
Refers to conclusion and written
Right.
examinations.
And I never looked at these
Written examinations done throughout some of these taser trainings?
In some taser trainings, they were yes.
And that's not done anymore, is that correct?
Then I'm gonna
Not currently, no.
Oh, okay, and let them know, and also put that I'm a victim of identity.
So this time, I would move for the admission of Exhibit 258.
Examination 258. Yes. What is 258, Mr. Frank?
It's a lesson plan from taser training.
No objection as to usability, redundancy is the objection.
All right, The exhibit will be admitted into evidence and you may publish it.
All right, do you see this then, Exhibit 258 on the stand?
Yes.
And what is that?
It is a lesson plan that was developed by one of our Taser instructors.
And so is that the sort of lesson plan for the actual Taser training?
Yes, it's the outline of what we would want to accomplish and do that day.
And you see in the Roman numerals there, the Taser presentation. Well, let me back up a little bit. Number 2 is Department of Policy and Legal Review, correct?
Yes.
And so that's the sort of classroom, part of the classroom section of it?
Yes.
And then the Taser presentation, is that referring to a PowerPoint?
Yes.
And then the written test, correct?
Yes.
And deployment of Taser.
Yes.
So it's a fairly standard format of the Taser trainings while you've been doing them with Brooklyn Center?
Over the years, yes, the standard format.
And deployment of the Taser, how is that done in those types of classes?
We have a static target that is placed at an optimal distance, either standing or in a laying down position. Depending on the instructors that we have there, we may have one instructor one run line, another instructor running different line, and then we cycle officers through as they perform the John, how to operate the safety, how to do a spark test, and then how to deploy a Taser.
Because I was arrested in Atlanta over these same charges, right? Forgery and writing bad checks and stuff like this. I was arrested for that. And when I went to court, they found out that it wasn't me, so I will be into those documentation as well.
This time around, I would move for the admission of Exhibit
I'm a
263,
victim of identity check.
Taser training outline from 2018.
Any objection to 216? All right. The objection is overruled. 216 will be admitted.
For the record, it's 263.
2011.
263. Thank you.
This worked out in my favor and
Put that on the screen for us, please.
14. And then I got
Do you
all the
recognize
documentation
that?
I needed in 2015. But I still had,
Yes.
but I still
And
let
this is
people know that I'm a victim of
essentially
identity
the outline
theft.
for the Taser
And on
refresher
top
in
of that, there's
2018,
still
correct?
people out there
Correct.
with my ID,
And
with my old
this is
ID.
sort of standard format outline for the trainings during this
Like I
stretch of
said,
years?
I never lived it.
Depending on what the topic was, yes.
Okay, what do you mean depending?
Well, they also list here chemical aerosols, intermediate weapons, so they may have also gone over some of those things at this training. I was not one of the instructors there, so I can't say for certain.
Are you familiar
Yes,
with
it
the
is.
instructors listed though?
I am.
I had a SunTrust account at that time.
And so this would
And
be
when that happened,
annual research
got
on the
shut
Taser,
down.
correct?
It appears so.
And then I would offer Your Honor
yeah,
Exhibit
GCI
264.
shut down all of my accounts.
Any objection to 264? 264 will be admitted into evidence.
And does this appear to be the Taser training PowerPoint from the 2018 presentation?
It appears that way.
And let's go to the next page, please. Up in the upper right, the
Okay.
expectations. Again,
question.
repeating
So,
the
because
expectations
if I wanted to
of safely
open up a bank
handling
account with
the
security free,
Taser,
I
correct?
would be able to do it, right?
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry, this is it's got to certify annually, correct?
Yes.
And then in the lower right corner of that page, again, you have that warning about tasers, correct?
Yes.
And
Okay, so,
that moment to remind you to
okay,
distribute
can I put a code word
the warnings,
on
correct?
my account?
Yes.
And we can go to the
Yes.
Security password.
Yes.
You may be referring to security alert. So let me first explain what is security alert. So if you add security alert and it's and will receive a flag on their system that this can
Yes.
And the CID screen.
Yes.
And then if you could skip to page 8 in the bottom corner. The same slide here about the spark or function test, correct?
Yes.
And then if you could skip to page 14, please. Here are those same smart use considerations about the amount of force to use, correct?
Yes.
And then if you would go to page 17, please. Here we have the holster pros and cons screen again, correct?
Yep.
So another topic are taught again, as well as probe placement and targeting, correct?
Yes.
And then let's go to the next page, please. In the lower right corner, again, deployment distance considerations, correct?
Yes.
In the 0 to 7 feet one, correct?
Yes.
If we can go to page 20, please. And again, instruction on limited effectiveness, correct?
Yes.
If you can go to page 21, please. Again, contingencies may not achieve the intended results, correct?
Correct.
But also, again, the warning about people operating vehicles or machineries in the lower left. Correct?
Yes.
And then if we go to towards the very end, there is a written test there as well, correct? Yeah, right? And that would be at least gone over in class, correct?
Depending on the year, correct.
Okay. So that's how it was taught in 2018, correct?
Can I ask how what was taught?
I'm sorry. I didn't hear you.
How what was taught?
All those subjects were taught again in Taser training in 2018.
According to that presentation, whoever received that presentation, that's what they learned, yes.
And I would offer Exhibit 243.
Any objection to 243? 243 will be admitted.
And if you could pull that up, please. Do you recognize what this is?
I do.
And is this a Taser PowerPoint for essentially 2020?
Yes.
Okay. And at the risk of dragging everybody through a whole nother PowerPoint, Would you agree that this contains a lot of the same subject matter as the 2018 PowerPoint?
For the most part, this appears as though it's a user update, which may have cut out some of the basic information about electricity and the background function of how a taser works.
And so, well, let me just do this. If you can go to page 9713, be the next page. Again, to provide the warnings, targeting, smart use considerations, correct?
Correct.
Now, and this was the 2020 version, correct?
That looked like it was version 22, I believe.
Okay. From 2020.
I think that was the date on the front of it.
Right.
The version number doesn't always correspond with the year.
Correct. So 2020, we all know, was the COVID year. Did that affect how you did the Taser update training that year?
Slightly, yes.
How so?
We had to go to a venue where we tried to conduct as much of the training outside as possible to limit inside time. We did not use electronic means, therefore we printed everything off on paper.
And gave that to each student?
Correct.
Now, after 2020, did the department change to a different Taser?
We did.
And it changed, I assume, to the Taser 7, correct?
Correct.
And so was there a requirement, first of all, that people who are, the officers who are carrying a Taser be certified or recertified in 2020?
They were recertified in 2020.
On the previous model?
Correct.
And then also be trained or certified on the new model, the Taser 7?
Yes.
And how was that done with them?
Taser creates a transition training, a PowerPoint test, some drills that we have to do to familiarize the officer, the end user, with how the Taser 7 differs from whatever product they were on before that.
So it's an introduction to the new device.
Correct.
Your Honor, at this time I would offer Exhibit 244.
244 will be admitted.
Did this, and do you recognize this as that PowerPoint from the transition course?
Yes.
And did it go through sort of the new parts of the Taser 7 that we talked about earlier, the lasers, the safety switch wasn't new, of course, but...
Yeah, I went over the differences between the Taser 7 and the product that we were on prior to that.
And at the end of it, it talks about drills and practical exercises. Do you recall that?
I believe so.
Yeah. Did you do that for that
Yes,
transition course?
I did.
And did you, in fact, teach that transition course?
I did.
And can you explain for the jurors how you did that, the drills and practical exercises?
So after we spent several hours in a classroom setting, the users had a Taser 7 in their hands. They were able to learn how it's different from the X26P that we were on. Once I was confident that they had a good understanding of how it worked, I went into a different area of our police department. I had set up a training scenario. Each officer came in one by one. I had a safety officer that was there running the scenarios, but I had created the scenarios. I was the subject that they were going to be working against, or I was the subject that they were going to have to use some type of force against. I had 2 different scenarios for each officer. When they were done with their scenario, we asked them to not discuss it with any other officers, to just try and give the other officers the best opportunity for training. And we went through the 2 scenarios.
And as part of those scenarios, were they required to draw their tasers and deploy them?
Yes.
And how did they deploy them without hurting somebody or getting another voluntary exposure?
So one of the features of a Taser 7 that we did not have on our previous platform is they have a training probe that is basically some Velcro that comes out, and it's connected to monofilament line that still runs back to the Taser. So no electrical current ever flows down to the subject that has those 2 little Velcro probes that connect onto them, but they still get the feel and the sound of what a Taser 7 would sound like if deployed.
And, okay, you can take that down. I'd like to show you Exhibit 246, please. Do you recognize what that is?
I do.
And do you see a signature down there towards the bottom?
I do.
And whose signature is that?
Mine.
And there, above your signature are some check marks. Did you place those there?
I did.
And what is the purpose of those check marks?
To show the officer was able to show their proficiency and competence in using the Taser 7.
And that was done through the classroom instruction as well as the scenarios, the drills?
Correct.
And that is why you placed your signature there, correct?
Yes.
And the student's signature above that is Miss Potter, correct?
It appears so, yes.
And this was done on March 2nd of 2021?
Yes.
All right, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about non-specific taser, training not specific to taser, just regular use of force training, the rest of the training. All right. Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 364 at this time.
To 364. 364 will be admitted into evidence.
And do you recognize this document?
Yes.
And explain, if you will, where this document comes from.
This document is prepared by the Minnesota Post Board, who oversees and tracks training that officers must get every year or through continuing education credits over their career.
And are there certain topics that are required as part of, or required by post for officer training?
So this document is specific to in-service, meaning officers who are currently licensed and on the street for use of force learning objectives. And there are many components of this document.
I'm glad you mentioned that because we see the term in-service quite a lot. What does that mean in regards to training?
There's a couple different definitions, but it generally means that an officer has passed their field training and are certified for solo patrol and are a licensed peace officer authorized to make arrests in the state of Minnesota.
So in-service training, to distinguish it from like new officer training.
Pre-service training is what we would call that.
All right. And the topics listed on Exhibit 364 are those specific topics required by post, correct?
Yes.
And this document is dated February of 2012. Is that right?
It appears so, yes.
Yeah. And so this is something Post has been putting out for quite a while.
Quite a long time.
Okay. And we see that, A is use of force, right? And so what is generally, topic A, use of force about?
It's pretty general, talking about the statutes that are in Minnesota that define what and when we can use force as police officers, but also the public. Other statutes, 69.3.2 and 3.3 about warrants and using the minimum amount of force necessary. And then the tactics that are listed there: verbal skills, empty hand techniques, intermediate weapons, deadly force, and how to use totality of the circumstances to make appropriate decisions.
So this is a lot of, classroom stuff, right?
It is, and a lot of this stuff is covered in other aspects of this document as well.
Okay. I'd like to go on to the next page then. And topic B, another topic required by post, correct?
Yes.
And what is B?
So it's giving the officers information that they may need or have before, during, and after a critical incident or use of force incident.
So this is referred to as readiness aspects of force, correct?
Yes.
And under the performance objectives, the number one there is how extremely stressful situations affect physical and mental functioning, correct?
Yes.
So has this been a topic of use of force training as long as you have been a trainer?
Yes.
And is this a required part of training every year?
Annually.
And how does the department, or how has it tried to fulfill that requirement?
Over the years, we try and educate the instructors on it by doing research. There's no hard and fast rule about how any of these things will affect any specific officer, but they're general guidelines that have been reported from other officers who have been in stressful situations, and things to note of officers as they prepare for a stressful situation or the aftermath of.
And so is this a way to try and teach them to think and act in real life
we're on a range, static target. We have a course of fire, and the post board says what certain percentages of our rounds have to be at different ranges, and we have them shoot that range, and they have to have a certain qualification score.
And how often is that done then?
Annually.
You were talking earlier about the scenario-based training, officers having all their weapons. Is that an attempt to incorporate all of these topics into training?
Yes.
And I'm going to move for the admission of exhibits 316 and 317.
Any objection? Okay.
No objection.
316 and 317 will be admitted into evidence.
I'm going to kind of show them in reverse order with 317 first. And do you recognize what this form is?
Yes.
And what is it?
This is an affidavit of attendance for a training session that anybody in the state of Minnesota can use for a course that has been approved by the Minnesota Peace Officer Standards and Training Board.
And if we scroll down to the second page, do you see a spot here for Officer Potter's signature?
I do.
And down on 31 there, correct?
Yes.
And what date did she attend that?
It says November 15th, 2016.
And does it indicate how long?
The class that day was approved for 8 hours or 8 credits.
All right. And if we can scroll back up, I'm sorry. What is the sort of the title attached to this training?
This one looks like it is a 2016 Brooklyn Center PD in-service.
And so in-service could cover a number of topics?
Yes.
All right. And so if we can go then to Exhibit 316. And do you see this explained there as well? Well, let me ask you this. Is this the outline from the November 15th in-service?
Yes.
And so we see that in the afternoon, there was a couple of hours on use of force policies and statutes
Yes.
taught by you.
Yes.
Okay. And so that's kind of how in-services are done, various topics, including sometimes use of force.
Yes.
And I want to go to offer Exhibit 325.
No objection.
That exhibit will be admitted into evidence.
I'm going to ask you if you recognize this. Well, no, that's the wrong number. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, you're right. Let's take that one down. Exhibit 271.
Any objection?
And 272, we might as well do that.
No objection.
271 and 272 will be admitted.
And let's start with 271. So this is the outline, I guess, if you will, of the November 15th, 2016 in-service, correct?
This looks like a lesson plan, correct?
And this will cover de-escalation, correct?
Yes.
As well as the use of force policies and Taser, correct?
Correct.
So this is sort of a typical layout of classes various topics, including here, Taser.
They vary from year to year.
And 272, please. From that same training, discussing the readiness aspects of use of force in 2016, correct?
Yes.
All right, then would offer Exhibit 318 and 321.
Any objection? To 318 and 321.
No, Your Honor.
Those will be admitted.
All right, let's look at 321, please. Here again, a sign-in sheet, correct?
Yes.
And if we can scroll down, you see Officer Potter had signed in for this as well
Yes.
on 9/5 of 17.
Yes.
All right, if we can scroll back up, this is for what kind of class?
It says it's a fall 2017 use of force.
And then if we can go to Exhibit 318. And so this is the fall use of force in service. The objectives: learning objective A is the use of force. Objective B is the readiness aspects, correct?
Yes.
And objective D, the taser. This was all taught in that class, for instance.
The classroom portions of Taser probably would not have been taught in this.
Okay. What would have been taught with reference to the taser?
So that would have been the scenario part of it.
Okay.
Same with chemical, intermediate weapons. So in here you can see under timeline there's 5 hours spent on scenarios. So we still cover parts of other learning objectives, but we may not go through the classroom portion of it.
So in this situation then, of this day, 5 hours was spent doing those scenarios.
Yes.
And, Your Honor, I would move for the admission of Exhibit 323.
323 will be admitted.
And do you recognize that?
Yes.
So this is a 2018 use of force, correct?
Yes.
And I think we need to scroll down to see Officer Potter's signature there, correct?
Yes.
And the 326 18.
Yes.
All right. And then I would offer, Your Honor, Exhibit 265.
Objections to 265?
Just a second. No, Your Honor.
265 will be admitted.
And is this the outline for that same class that Officer Potter had signed into we just looked at?
It appears so, yes.
And indicating that this use of force would include scenario-based training as well.
Not this one. It does not appear so, no.
Why not? I'm sorry.
This looks like it's just rest and control or defensive tactics, as some call it. 2 hours is pretty tight to cover that category and have scenarios built into it.
Okay. And exhibit, if I could, Your Honor, offer 266.
Any objection to 266?
No, Your Honor.
That'll be admitted.
And this for the use of force in service later that year, correct?
Yes.
And would this include scenario-based training as well?
Yes.
All right. And so this was done in 2018 as well.
Yes.
To move sort of quickly along, in exhibits 327 and 330, Your Honor.
Any objection to those exhibits?
No, Your Honor.
They'll be admitted.
And if we could put up exhibit 330. And this is a sign-in for the low light and inclement weather training, correct?
Correct.
And if we scroll down, Officer Potter signed in to that on 10/26.
It appears so, yes.
And if we can go to 3/27. Again, an instructional block here, correct?
Yes.
But scenario-based training would have been done at some point with this?
Yes.
And, Your Honor, if I could offer Exhibit 259.
Any objections to 259?
Right now.
259 will be admitted.
I'll put that up. So here again is the October 2020 in-service, is that correct?
Yes.
And that includes, A, the use of force, correct?
Yes.
And if we can scroll, well, and we don't have to, at the bottom, B, the readiness aspects of force
Yes.
taught in the fall of 2020.
Yes.
So kind of I've tried to just get a flavor of how those years have gone, where you'll have a couple of trainings each year for use of force, the aspects that post requires.
Yes.
And would each of those include scenario-based training or not always?
As much as possible, we try and include it, but it's limited by time we're given, resources we have. But as much as possible, I try and incorporate them.
And I'm going to show you now what has previously been admitted as Exhibit 335. Do you recognize what that is?
I know the format.
Okay. A record of
Training.
Training. You'll see over in the name of training column, do you know who enters that information?
What column?
The name of training column?
That would mostly come from any affidavit of attendance that was filled out for a approved class, or an external training that the officer attended, which was not in our control.
And so this is just a real brief description of what the actual class was.
Correct.
Your Honor, can I just have a moment, please?
Yes.
Just one final question. Sergeant Peterson, in all the years that you've been working at the Brooklyn Center Police Department, have you been aware of any other officers who have drawn their handgun when they meant to draw their taser?
I don't.
And in the scenario-based training, has that ever happened?
It's not a topic that I frequently think about. I would have to take a considerable amount of time to think about that.
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking if somebody has ever said to you, that's not what I meant to do.
I have conducted so many trainings, run so many trainings that they honestly all blur together. I couldn't pick out a specific time.
I have nothing further for the witness here.
Yes. All right, members of the jury, we're going to stop for the day, and we're going to start up again at 9 o'clock. Have a wonderful evening. Okay, officer, you may step down.
This is the live battery.
Counsel, see you tomorrow.
Let's not put it in.
Merry Christmas.
All right, y'all.
Merry Christmas.
Good night.
Merry
I'll see y'all in the future. Peace. Thank you.